For most of its history, darts was a game played in the corner of a pub, a pint in one hand, a set of arrows in the other, a haze of cigarette smoke hanging over the jockey. It was born in the bar, and for decades the bar came with it, right onto the television stage, right into the biggest arenas in the sport. But there is a darker side to that story. Behind the walk-on music and the roaring crowds, some of the biggest names this sport has ever produced fought private battles that had nothing to do with checkouts or averages. Battles with the bottle, battles with gambling, battles with substances that cost some of them their health, their fortunes, and in the cruellest cases, their lives. Tonight, we are going to tell those stories honestly and with respect, not to sensationalize and not to judge, but because addiction has shadowed this sport for as long as it has been on our screens, and the men who lived through it deserve to have their struggles understood rather than whispered about. This is not a story about villains. It is a story about human beings, some of them world champions, who got caught in something far bigger than a game of darts. And it is a story that, in its own way, is still being written today. To understand why addiction and darts have been so tightly bound together, you have to go back to where the sport came from, and you have to be honest about the culture that surrounded it. Darts grew up in the pub. That is not an insult, it is simply the truth. Through the great television boom of the late 1970s and the 1980s, players like Eric Bristow, Jockey Wilson, John Lowe, and Bobby George became household names, drawing enormous audiences. The game show Bullseye pulled in audiences of up to 20 million people at its peak. And for years, the players smoked and drank alcohol on stage, openly, in full view of the cameras. It was a direct reflection of the game's origins. It became such a defining image that in 1980, the satirical BBC show Not the 9 O'Clock News ran a famous sketch mocking it, in which two overweight darts players, instead of throwing darts, simply took turns downing shots of alcohol while a commentator narrated the drinking. Everyone laughed, but underneath the joke sat an uncomfortable reality. In darts, alcohol was not a vice hidden away in private. It was part of the show. It was part of the identity of the sport itself. The governing body of the day, the British Darts Organisation, eventually tried to clean up that image. Smoking on stage was banned during matches in 1988, and a ban on alcohol on stage followed soon afterwards. But as the veteran Bobby George bluntly observed, it made very little difference to the fading interest in the game at that time. And more importantly, banning the bottle from the stage did nothing to address the deeper relationship that some players had already formed with drink. The culture had already shaped a generation. And that brings us to the man whose story sits at the very heart of this subject. Andy Fordham was one of the most beloved figures the sport has ever known. Nicknamed the Viking for his long hair, his thick beard, and his sheer physical presence, he was a genuine fan favourite, known for his warmth and his generosity as much as his darts. In 2004, at the Lakeside, he reached the summit of his career and won the BDO World Championship, beating Mervyn King in the final. But behind that triumph was a level of drinking that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. By his own admission, in the year he won that world title, Fordham was drinking an enormous amount every single day. He would later describe consuming, in the build-up to big matches, something close to a bottle of brandy alongside 24 bottles of beer. He weighed, at his heaviest, around 31 stone, and by his own account, he was rarely sober. Fordham was always painfully honest about why he drank. And this is the part that matters most, because it reveals the mechanism that traps so many players. It was about the nerves. He explained that the first time he qualified for the Lakeside, the thought of a big crowd watching made him so nervous that he began to drink more and more and more. The alcohol steadied his hand. It quietened the fear. Everything he did, he said, became an excuse to have a drink. Whether it was a darts match, or getting on a plane, or meeting someone, he would be in the ice. Bar hours beforehand. That is the terrible logic of it. In a sport where the tiniest tremor in your hand can cost you everything, alcohol can feel, in the moment, like medicine. It works. And because it works, the dependency deepens. The reckoning came in January 2007. At the World Championship, just before he was due to play a first-round match live on the BBC, Fordham collapsed behind the scenes. He was rushed to hospital and diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver. His condition was so severe that it triggered a minor stroke and placed him on the liver transplant list. A doctor later told him that a huge proportion of his liver was already dead and that the rest of it was dying. It was, by any measure, a death sentence delivered as a warning, and to Fordham's enormous credit, he heard it. What followed was one of the most remarkable recovery stories in the sport. Fordham gave up alcohol. He shed a staggering amount of weight, around 17 stone by some accounts. He spoke openly and without vanity about how bad things had become, and he did it not to boast, but to be honest. He even appeared on television weight loss programs as part of his effort to turn his life around. For years afterward, he did not touch a drop, and the fact that he was alive at all was described by those who understood his medical history as nothing short of a biological miracle. Sadly, Andy Fordham's story does not have a fairy tale ending. His health never fully recovered from the damage those years had done, and he passed away in July 2021 at the age of 59, 6 months after a COVID infection. Tributes poured in from across the darting world, from world champions to commentators, all of them remembering the gentle giant behind the Viking persona. His story remains the clearest, starkest illustration of how the drinking culture of old darts could very nearly kill one of its biggest stars, and the courage it took for him to fight back. If Fordham's story shows the danger of alcohol, then the story of Jockey Wilson shows how a similar path could unfold in a very different way, and how carefully we have to tread when we talk about these things. Jockey Wilson was a Scottish icon, a two-time world champion. From Kirkcaldy in Fife, he rose from a hard, working-class background to become one of the most recognisable faces in 1980s Britain. His throwing style was unorthodox, once memorably described as throwing his darts like a hand grenade, but he made up for it with an uncanny ability to hit the target and a refusal to ever believe he was beaten. Wilson was famous too for his love of a drink. Stories from his era are the stuff of darting folklore, including tales of him topping up vodka with a splash of cola and drinking it like beer, with rivals joking that the more he drank, the better he played. But here is where honesty demands care. His friend and fellow player Bobby George, who knew him about as well as anyone in the sport and roomed with him at events around the world, pushed back firmly on the label of alcoholic. George insisted that while Jockey liked to drink and was a heavy smoker, he was, in George's words, really a gentleman, and not the caricature that some painted him as. That distinction matters. It is a reminder that from the outside, we often cannot know the full truth of another person's relationship with drink, and that reaching too quickly for the word addict can be both unfair and inaccurate. What is not in dispute is the sadness of how Wilson's life unfolded. Through a combination of poor financial choices and his lifestyle, he left the sport in the mid-1990s with very little to show for his fame, retreating back to Kirkcaldy and largely disappearing from public life. He died in 2012 at the age of 62 from chronic lung disease. Whatever the precise label, his was a life of enormous highs followed by a quiet, difficult decline, and the sport remembers him with deep affection. Before we move to the modern game, it is worth pausing on something that connects all of these stories, because it explains so much about why this sport in particular has struggled with these issues. It is the peculiar cruelty of what darts asks of a human body. Think about what the sport actually demands. You stand on a stage in front of thousands of screaming people with millions more watching at home, and you are asked to perform an act of the most delicate precision imaginable. You must throw a small metal dart with a feather-like touch into a target the width of a wire, and you must do it while your heart is pounding and adrenaline is flooding your system. There is no teammate to hide behind. There is no physical outlet for the tension, no tackle to make, no sprint to run. There is only you, your nerves, and the board. In almost every other sport, adrenaline is your friend. It makes you faster, stronger, sharper. In darts, adrenaline is very often your enemy. It makes your hands shake. It tightens your muscles at the exact moment you need them loose. And so, for generations of players, alcohol did not feel like a weakness. It felt like the solution. A few drinks quietened the storm. It slowed the heart, steadied the hand, and silenced the voice of doubt. This is precisely what Andy Fordham described so honestly. The drink worked, and that is the trap. When a substance appears to solve the very problem that stands between you and success, the descent into dependency can feel less like a fall and more like a sensible professional decision. That is what makes it so dangerous and so hard to escape. Now, it would be easy to think of all of this as history, as something belonging to a smoky, boozy past that modern darts has left behind. But that would be a mistake, because addiction did not disappear when the sport professionalized. It simply changed shape. The modern game has confronted the issue far more openly than the sport of the past ever did. The Professional Darts Players Association, the PDPA, now provides its members with access to mental health and addiction support, working with a charity called Sporting Chance. That organization offers confidential one-to-one counseling, education, and even a residential treatment program for addictive disorders covering alcohol, drugs, and gambling. The very existence of that support tells you something important. It tells you that the people running darts today understand that these problems are real, that they are ongoing, and that players need somewhere to turn. And the modern era has produced its own cases, handled not with a wink and a laugh, but with formal testing and real consequences, since anti-doping and drug testing were introduced to professional darts in 2006. A number of players have fallen foul of the rules, and these are not distant stories. One of the most recent and most striking involved a player named Dom Taylor. At the 2025 World Darts Championship at Alexandra Palace, the sports showpiece event, Taylor was subjected to a random drug test. The result came back positive for both cocaine and cannabis. He was suspended with immediate effect, removed from the tournament, and forced to forfeit his prize money, a sum of £25,000. The disciplinary committee established that his use of the substances had occurred out of competition before the tournament began, but because this was his second offence, having previously served a shorter ban after failing a test at a Players' Championship event, he received a mandatory 6-month ban under the anti-doping rules. And crucially, the punishment cost him his tour card, his very right to compete at the top level. Think about what that represents. A player at the pinnacle event of the darting calendar, losing his place, his prize money, and his professional status, all in the space of a few days. It is a world away from the on-stage pints of the 1980s. The tolerance is gone, the testing is real, and for a player caught in the grip of substance use, the consequences are now immediate and severe. But here is something we have to be careful and fair about. A failed drug test is not automatically proof of addiction. Someone can use a substance recreationally or occasionally or foolishly without being an addict, and it would be wrong to brand any individual with that label simply because they failed a test. What these cases do show, however, is that the temptations and the substances are present in the modern game, and that the sport is now willing to police them in a way it never used to. And there is another form of addiction lurking in modern darts that deserves honest attention, one that is arguably more insidious than any substance, precisely because it is so deeply woven into the fabric of the sport. Gambling. Look at professional darts today and you cannot escape it. Betting. Companies sponsor the biggest tournaments. Their logos are on the stage, on the shirts, in the arena, and all over the broadcast. The relationship between darts and the gambling industry is not incidental. It is fundamental to how the modern sport is funded, and that creates an obvious and uncomfortable tension, because gambling addiction is a genuine and serious public health issue, and its danger lies in its invisibility. As addiction experts have pointed out, you can usually tell when someone is drunk. You cannot tell when someone has quietly stepped away, placed a large bet on their phone, and come back to the table as though nothing has happened. In an age of mobile betting apps, where a wager can be placed at any hour, on almost anything, the opportunity for harm is constant and hidden. Research increasingly links problem gambling to anxiety, depression, and other forms of substance abuse, and the people most at risk are often young men, which happens to describe a very large part of the darting audience. The sport has also had to confront the way gambling can corrupt the integrity of the game itself. In recent years, the Darts Regulation Authority has handed down significant bans to players found guilty of match fixing and betting-related offences, working alongside the Gambling Commission's own intelligence unit. These are serious matters, and while match fixing is a different issue from personal addiction, they both flow from the same source. A sport that is bankrolled by betting money will always live close to the fire. None of this is a simple morality tale. Darts did not choose to be born in the pub, and it did not invent addiction. But the sport has, throughout its history, existed in a uniquely close relationship with the very things that can destroy a person. Alcohol was once part of the performance. Gambling is now part of the business, and substances, as recent cases show, are never far from any professional environment. There is one more thread worth pulling on before we close, because addiction rarely exists in isolation. It so often grows out of something else. Pressure, loneliness, the strange hollow feeling that can follow the end of a career or the fading of the fire that once drove a player forward. The former world #1, Colin Lloyd, once spoke, movingly, about how it felt when his own hunger for the game began to fade. He described how walking into a darts venue had once lit what he called a blazing fire in his belly, and how, over time, that blaze shrank to little more than a flickering match. It broke his heart, he said, to realize that something he had dedicated his entire life to was, in a sense, slipping away from him. Not because of anything he had done wrong, but simply because his time was passing. That feeling, that loss of identity and purpose, is something psychologists recognize as a genuine risk moment for anyone in any walk of life. When the thing that defined you is gone, when the crowds move on and the trophies gather dust, there is a void. And the void is precisely where addiction so often takes root. This is not to say that every player who steps away from the sport is at risk. Most are not, but it helps explain why the support systems that darts has built in recent years matter so much. The dangers are not only about the temptations in front of a player during their career, they are also about what happens when that career and the identity built around it comes to an end. That is why the quiet, unglamorous work of organisations like Sporting Chance is arguably as important as any trophy handed out on a Sunday night. Recovery does not make headlines the way a collapse does. Nobody live streams a player sitting in a counselling session or celebrating a year of sobriety or rebuilding a life piece by piece. But those are the stories that actually matter, and they are happening, quietly, all the time. So where does that leave us? It leaves us, above all, with a sense of respect for the men who fought these battles in public, often long before it was acceptable to talk about such things. Andy Fordham stared down a death sentence and clawed his way back to sobriety, and he spoke about it honestly so that others might understand. Jockey Wilson lived a life of dazzling highs and a heartbreaking decline, and his friends have fought to protect the truth of who he really was rather than the caricature. And a new generation now competes under a system of testing and support that the old guard never had, one that treats addiction as an illness to be managed rather than a shame to be hidden. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is that these players were never simply cautionary tales. They were human beings, extraordinarily gifted at a very difficult game, who happened to work in an environment that placed temptation right in front of them, night after night, year after year. Some were consumed by it, some fought free of it. All of them deserve to be remembered as more than their struggles. Darts has grown up enormously, the smoke has cleared, the on-stage pints are long gone, and there is real help available now for anyone in the sport who needs it. That progress is worth celebrating. But the shadow has not vanished entirely, and as long as the game lives so close to the bottle and the betting slip, the sport would do well to keep telling these stories, honestly and with compassion, so that the mistakes of the past are never quietly forgotten. Because behind every walk-on, every roar of the crowd, every treble 20, there is a human being. And some of them have carried far heavier burdens than we ever saw from our seats. Addiction is a serious issue, and if anything in this story resonates with you or someone you know, please do reach out to a doctor or a support organisation in your country. Help exists, and asking for it is a sign of strength, not weakness. Thank you for watching. If you found this one thoughtful, hit that like button, subscribe to the Dart Side, and we will see you next time, right here on the Oki.